promised when we went over to Ruth for the last 3 weeks that we would come back, kind of close out Judges in an introduction to 1 Samuel. So we're going to skip over Ruth. We've covered that book, but we need to go back to Judges 19 and talk about the segue between Israel as kind of a loosely connected alliance of tribal groups to Israel as a kingdom. And it happens during the lifetime, during the tenure of Samuel. So to move from the time of the judges to the time of the kings, you basically go through Samuel. And that's what we're going to be talking about over the next several weeks, is his life, his career, how God used him. But the book of Judges ends with a really horrible scenario, and we'll dance our words around it, but you'll be able to fill in the blanks. Look at chapter 19, beginning in verse 1. In those days, Israel had no king. What's the last part of that formula? We've looked at it several times. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? So we'll run across that one even again tonight. There was a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim. He took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah, but she was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her parents' home in Bethlehem, Judah. After she had been there 4 months, her husband went to her to persuade her to return. He had with him his servant and 2 donkeys. She took him to her parents' home, and when her father saw him, he gladly welcomed him. His father-in-law, the woman's father, prevailed on him to stay, so he remained with him 3 days, eating and drinking and sleeping there. I want you to remember a couple of things. First of all, remember that this guy is a Levite, which means he's part of the tribe of Levi, which means he's part of the priestly tribe. But the tribe of Levi does not have its own territory. They were dispersed to be servants among all the people of Israel. And this one in particular lives at Ephraim, which is where Samuel's family is from. So they may have been loosely connected. They may have been distant family members, just people from the tribe of Levi who were living in Ephraim about that time. His storyline is really unfortunate. When his concubine goes back home, he goes to bring her back to himself. The father keeps him every time they get ready to leave. Daddy comes up with another reason why they need to stay. And so they're there for several days. And by the time they leave, they're running behind schedule and they're a little short on time. As they're traveling, it's getting later in the day. And the young man does not want to stay anywhere that is not Israeli occupied. They want to make sure that the town they stay in is extended family, at least from the tribe of Israel. The problem that they run into is they choose a place called Gibeah, which is from the tribe of Benjamin in their territory. And the people of Gibeah are very much like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. They are ruthless, they prey on outsiders, and they are interested more in the man than they are in his concubine. So the same kind of scenario plays out. They get there late in the day. They're staying in the city square. There's a man from town who sees them there and says, "You can't stay here in the city square. It's not safe. So come home with me." Shows them good hospitality. Takes them back to his house. And in the middle of the night, here come all the men from Gibeah. They surround the house just as the men of Sodom and Gomorrah had surrounded Lot's house. And they call for them to deliver up the man, right? Send him out. The owner of the house says, "I have a virgin daughter, and we have this man's concubine. We could send them out." And the men refuse. That's not what they want. Eventually, if you remember, in Lot's case, they were angels, and so they struck the men blind, so we didn't have a final showdown. But in this case, the man takes his concubine and shoves her out the door. And the men of town abuse her all night. And the next morning, she is able to get back to the doorstep, but that's as far as she makes it. And when the man comes out in the morning, then he finds his concubine there on the doorstep, puts her on his donkey, and heads for home. He decides that the best way to take care of this problem is to try to hold all of Benjamin responsible for making sure that Gibeah pays the price, right? They're from that tribe, and so Benjamin ought to step up, the tribe of Benjamin ought to step up, the elders of that tribe, try the case, turn this guy over, or turn these men over for punishment, and then that'll be the end of it. They're not willing to do that. He takes his concubine and separates her into 12 parts and sends her to the 12 tribes of Israel, which means that Benjamin also receives a gift from this man. And this is where things change. This is the one big turning point that you could point to and say, okay, before this, they were just kind of random, semi-connected tribes. And after this, they're more of a combined unit. Look over at chapter 20, verse 12. No, let's stay in 19 a minute. Go to 27. Let's get that first. Verse 30, everyone who saw it was saying to one another, such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Just imagine, we must do something, so speak up. Who's we? All 12 tribes. Chapter 20, verse 1, then all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and from the land of Gilead came together as one and assembled in front of the Lord at Mizpah. The leaders of all the people of the tribes of Israel took their places in the assembly of God's people, 400,000 men armed with swords. The Benjamites heard the Israelites had gone up to Mizpah. Then the Israelites said, tell us how this awful thing happened. And they heard the man's testimony. Representatives from 11 out of the 12 tribes. Right? Benjamin is not participating. Benjamin has decided that they're going to protect their own at Gibeah. A small civil war ensues. The people of Israel basically wipe out the men of the tribe of Benjamin and have to eventually come up with wild, wonderful, and interesting ways of getting them women so that the tribe of Benjamin doesn't just cease to exist. And I'll leave that to you to read the rest of it. But they are, as a nation, ready to do something about the situation. Look over at verse 12. The tribes of Israel sent messengers throughout the tribe of Benjamin, saying, what about this awful crime that was committed among you? Now turn those wicked men of Gibeah over to us, so that we may put them to death and purge the evil from Israel. But the Benjamites would not listen to their fellow Israelites. So don't miss the thinking here. We, that is 11 out of the 12 tribes, want you to turn over this group of men for punishment because they did something in Benjamin, but it has put a stain on all of Israel. So they're not thinking like tribes where you would say, oh, did you hear what happened in Benjamin? You know, isn't it horrible that they live that way? This is, we are Israel united, and we're not going to put up with Benjamin as part of united Israel allowing things like that to go on. So again, a war ensues. Benjamin is defeated soundly, and a lot of the men of Benjamin are then gone. And again, you have to go over to chapter 21, to the last chapter of Judges is kind of in there to show us how Benjamin gets wives again. And you might enjoy that read. But in the very end of chapter 21, before you get to the book of Ruth and before we get to Samuel, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. So as long as you're in the book of Judges, you never get an answer to the question, but you can see the movement. Things are headed toward a united Israel toward the end of the book of Judges. And then comes a guy named Samuel. And Samuel is going to be the segue, the answer, the solidifier, who helps to bring things together. And he will be three different things at least to the children of Israel. He will be a priest. He will serve in the capacity kind of as a judge. And he'll be a prophet. I mean, this guy is the whole package. He is never the sole commander of Israel, as far as he's never a king. He doesn't really want to be a king. But when Israel seeks a king, he feels it because he's been, that guy. He's been the one out in front, being their priest, being their prophet. He was the leading edge of things, but he was never named, King Samuel. He never got that thing. But he is responsible for anointing kings. And so he puts in place kings of Israel. All right. 1 Samuel chapter 1. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jehoram, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had two wives. One was called Hannah, and the other was called Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. I want to notice a couple of things. I like the King James entry into this one a little bit better than I like the NIV. There was a man from Ramathaim Zophim. I like that. It's my favorite place name in all Scripture. I don't know how you actually pronounce it, but if you were born in Tennessee and raised in Alabama and Texas, it's Ramathaim Zophim. That's where they were from. Whose name was Elkanah. Elkanah is never really an important part of the story, but Elkanah is the fifth Elkanah in his family line. So evidently the people in his lineage loved the name Elkanah. And so he was named after, great-great-great-great-granddaddy, who was named after great-great-great-great-granddaddy. It was a name that they held in high regard, and so he was Elkanah the fifth. He has two wives, one named Hannah, which in our language would be grace, and Peninnah, in our language that would be the pearl. So he's got the pearl and he's got grace. Hannah is barren. Peninnah has kids. Who's going to be the hero of this story? Hannah, right? Peninnah's an also-ran. If Peninnah's already got kids when we meet her, we know she's not going to be the one that God's going to use in this situation. Peninnah has children, and Peninnah is kind of haughty about that fact. Every year, Elkanah would take his whole family to Shiloh to have a sacrifice and a feast. In those days, it was a little bit like we do the Lord's Supper. Jesus gathered all of his disciples, and he broke the bread, and he said, "Eat this, it's my body." And he took the wine, and he said, "Drink this, this is my blood." And so every week we have this kind of communal meal. In those days, you made your sacrifice, and then part of the sacrifice was given to the family, and you would eat there at the tabernacle and celebrate your connection to the Lord through this sacrifice. So every year, Elkanah would take his family, and they would make their sacrifices, and they would have their big meal. Well, Peninnah has sons and daughters, right? So she's got several kids. And Elkanah would make sure that he doled out all the food to Peninnah and her kids, but he would give Hannah extra, right? He loved Hannah. He thought highly of her. He wanted her to be happy. But Hannah wasn't happy because Peninnah would make fun of her. She would let her know. It doesn't tell us how she did it, just that she did it, that she made Hannah's life unhappy because Hannah didn't have any kids. Every now and then, Becky and I have a conversation about whether it was ever a good idea for men to have more than one wife. Guess what Becky's opinion is? She doesn't think it's a great idea. In this case, it wasn't good. The sister wives weren't very well connected. They were just two women who were married to the same man, and Peninnah was mean to her because she couldn't have children. And so every year they would go down, and you're having a big family meal. Think Thanksgiving, think Christmas, and you're the loner. You're the one without any kids, and here's Peninnah with all of hers wrapped around the table as you're eating. Hannah finally got all she could take. She got up from the table, went for a walk, and while she was walking, she was praying. And she was asking what all of us have heard, that if the Lord would give her a son, that she would give him back to the Lord to serve the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor would never touch his head. So like Samson, she was going to raise from birth a Nazirite. The difference is when Samson was in the makings, the angel told them, you're going to make sure he's a Nazirite. Hannah says, I'm taking this on myself. I'm going to give him back to you. I'm going to make sure that he is holy from the beginnings. I'm never even going to cut his hair. When I think of the heroes of the Old Testament, perhaps with Samson being the exclusion, I always think of them looking like me, right? The heroes of the Old Testament had burr haircuts. They didn't have, hair down past their seat. Samuel was a good Nazirite. He is kind of the opposite of Samson in his Nazirite vow. We never see Samuel doing anything that we would say, oh man, how would a man of God act like that? But Samuel, because of that, would have never cut his hair. And his hair would have been quite long all the days of his life. So when we're talking about him standing there talking to King Saul, or when he's anointing David to be king, I always think about, burr haircut, short-haired guy. But he wasn't. He was a very long-haired guy because he had that Nazirite vow. Same thing would be true of John the Baptist. If you've never thought about the guy who was doing all that baptizing, he wore leather and he had hair down past the middle of his back at least, very long hair. And he was in the water and out of the water, and in the water and out of the water. He must have been a sight. You wouldn't have walked up to him in polite company and said, oh, well, there's John the Baptist. I'd like to hang out with him, take him to lunch. I mean, these guys didn't look like maybe the way that our minds conjure up the way they would look. But Hannah promises God, this is what I'll do if you'll give me a son. While she's praying, the priest Eli, whom, he's going to raise Samuel, he's going to play a very important role in the life of Samuel, but he's already there. His sons Hophni and Phinehas are serving at the temple. And he sees Hannah walking around mumbling. So his immediate thought is not, oh, isn't it nice that Grace is praying? His immediate thought is, she's drunk. I need to go and intervene. And so here comes the priest and corners Hannah and says, how long are you going to keep drinking? It's bar time, babe. The bell rang. It's time to quit. Last call. Stop. Give it up. You're making a fool of yourself. And she has to explain herself to Eli. Verse 15 of chapter 1. Hannah replied, I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. You like that play on words? They weren't pouring out the liquor for me. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. And here is his answer. Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. So Eli kind of has to swallow his words. He realizes what's going on, and now he's in. He likes what she's doing. He's proud of what she's trying to accomplish, and he has mercy on her. He has some grace for grace. And she says, may your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. I don't know how soon Hannah thought that God was going to answer the prayer. She's gotten a blessing from the priest. She'd offered a prayer to God kind of where God was. In their mind, you go to the tabernacle, God's in there in that golden box, right? The Ark of the Covenant was nearby. So she's praying in a place where God ought to be, and they've made their sacrifices. And the priest has said, I want for you what you want for you. I hope that things work out. I wonder how soon she knew, how quickly, was it a few days? Was it a few weeks? Was it a few months before she finally realized that she was finally going to have a child, that God was answering her prayer? But it does say that she went and she ate, and her face was no longer downcast. So she's sitting at the table with Peninnah and all of Peninnah's kids. But it's different now. Something has changed in Hannah's life. She's got peace where there was a problem. Now, I don't want to forget to mention what Elkanah has said to Hannah. Go back to verse 8. Here's Hannah is unhappy. Her rival provoked her until she cried, and she wouldn't eat. And her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? And here's something only a man could think of to say. Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Now, that should be on a Hallmark card. That's Valentine's Day, right? Give her some candy and a flower, and am I not more important to you than 10 sons? The answer is, well, I love you, but sure would like to have a child. Sure would like to not be that woman at the table who doesn't have any children. But finally, she's going to. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. In other words, I prayed, God listened. So the kid's name is, God was listening. God heard me. So I love the name all of his life. Every time somebody calls his name, they're saying, hey, God was listening to your mama. God listened when your mom prayed that she would have a child. So she names him a very appropriate name. The next thing that we'll talk about, of course, is when Samuel is a young man and God calls him, and now Samuel hears what God says because God heard what Hannah said. So we will talk about that some more, Lord willing, next week. Any questions about any of this in particular? No? Oriental hospitality. Women were less important. Think about maybe not his daughter so much, although when the daughter grew up, depending on the cultural setting, either he would have to pay somebody to take her or somebody would buy her from him. So there would be money exchanged. A dowry would be involved. As far as the concubine is concerned, it refers to this woman two different ways. It refers to him as his wife and to her family as his in-laws, but it also refers to her as a concubine. So she had some standing, but not as much standing perhaps as a regular wife would have had. He let her stay gone 4 months before he went to get her, and then he reclaimed his property, went and got her and was going to take her back home. So I guess answer A is women were of less value in their culture. So, you offered to trade for something that would do but wasn't what they were looking for. To have power over the men that had come to their house was seen as more of it was more powerful to have them than it was to have the women, because they were just women. And then again, just that part of the world, the hospitality would demand that you hurt yourself before you allow somebody to be hurt that's under your roof. So you save the man, sacrifice the women. That's unfortunately the best answer I have to that question, but that's probably the reason.
I think as the mother of Hannah wanting this child for so long and then giving him to the priest and saying, here he is.
Yeah. She had other children. I mean, God did not leave her childless after Samuel, but that would have been, when you make a promise to God, keep it. But there had to be a point in the middle of the pregnancy, toward the end of the pregnancy, where she was thinking, now, what, maybe I misspoke. Maybe I shouldn't have done it that way. But we never see that. We never see her making that question. I've run into cases where young women were going to give their children up for adoption. That child is not adopted until they sign the paperwork, right? So the child is born and the mother says, I changed my mind. And Hannah certainly could have, but we wouldn't know a thing about her. You know, she lives on throughout the centuries as a faithful woman who gave God a son who was going to be an amazing, help to the nation of Israel.
I mean, you'd be proud of him, but.
Oh, yeah. She was, and she interacts with him. We'll talk about it next week. I mean, she comes to be with him from time to time, but she's not raising him. He's being raised by somebody else. She kept him probably till he was, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5. She weaned him. We don't know how long that was, but after that, he's growing up in somebody else's house, which is very, very different from our way of thinking. Anybody else? Thoughts on this? All right. Well, we will see some amazing things that this amazing young man does in the next, probably 3 or 4 weeks as we move from the time of the judges over into the time of the kings. All right. We'll see you guys later.